All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Tony Alpert. I'm the Executive Director for Smarter Balance. Excited to have this conversation with you. If we can just start out, I can't promise I'll remember your name, but I'll try. Your name and the institution you support, or your district or school, and then the number of students you serve.
I'll start off. So, yeah, I'm Patrick Swisher, so I work for Parsec. I'm one of the educational analysts.
Cutie Galt, Sanger Unified. I am a coordinator of data and assessment, so local state assessments, and then also our SIS and CalPATs and things like that. We have about 13,600 students, 7,000 of which take the test.
My name is Morgan Gilda. I'm with Kings County Office of Education. As far as the students we serve, we have a juvenile court school. We usually only test between 3 and 10 kids per year there, and then we have a special education site. It's usually around 100 kids that we test.
I'm Tim. I also work for Parsec. I work on some of the dashboards.
I'm Andres. I also work with Parsec, and I'll work with the dashboards as well.
Cornell Cotton, President of Unified School District. I'm one of the admin analysts, and it's a little over 73,000 students.
Thank you.
I'm Soren Gutierrez. I work for Visions in Education. We have 7,500 students, about 3,000 that test per year.
My name is Veronica. I'm the data support specialist with River Islands Academies out of Lakera. We have about a little over 3,000 students.
Mary Cochran, Medicare educational measurement. So I work with the organizations that work with students. So right now, got a few states under me, so I don't know, 300,000 maybe.
All right. Thank you.
Jeff Becker, the Learning Choice Academy. We have about 1,100 students.
I'm Shelley Roth. I'm at Stone Creek Elementary School. I'm the principal, and we have 700 students.
Excellent.
Yes, you're your homeschool.
Yeah.
Really appreciate that you're here, interested in talking about data. I haven't done this presentation before. I created it for you folks and whomever else is going to attend in the second session. So I don't know if it's going to work, but I'm flexible. And so if you want to go in a different direction than what I've otherwise planned, then I'm happy to do that as well. But my goal is to try and give you some context, help you better utilize your data so that you can either support students directly or support your teachers to be able to use the data more effectively depending on your role. So we're going to do a little bit of talking, level setting about the Smarter Balance assessment, discuss approaches to understanding the results, and then depending on time and your interest, we could talk about some upcoming changes that Smarter Balance is working on. So if you can do some either table chat or partnering chat, I'll leave it up to you. Identify one question about Smarter Balance that you just scratch your head and say, why did they do it this way? So we'll take 2 minutes. Or if you already have a question, you don't have to confer. We might have a bunch of introverts here. But encourage you to just talk with each other, and then we'll do a quick report out.
I think a lot of the reason why that near the gasoline under that, and I get the smaller amount of questions, there's more error, but that's awesome. How many more questions to be able to differentiate into 4 levels? These teachers always ask.
Yeah.
How much is the performance test related? It's not really. It is just
How much further below or but they want a little bit more insight and maybe a range of how far away they are.
I'm just
So you feel like a casual sometimes. When you have a lot of schools like that, they're meeting to the building, just looking for a place to
So, folks, I don't want to interrupt the conversation, but I'm curious as to what your questions are. So, why don't we start with the table back there? If you what are your top questions that you have about Smarter Balance? Who wants to go first?
I have teachers share that some of the drag and drop in third grade, it's pretty, as far as the design of the test. It's pretty tricky. They're only in third grade, although they've been on their computers a lot. They think the students struggle with that.
So, question would be, or maybe that's just feedback. But a question might be, why did we include drag and drop items, and do we do any kind of testing of accessibility around that? And we did do, for every item is associated with what we call a task model. So the task model, how many are you familiar with task models as a concept? So Smarter Balance was used an innovative approach called evidence-centered design, where we start with the content and we ask, what would the evidence look like that a teacher would collect about whether or not the student has been able to demonstrate that knowledge and skills that's required by the content standards. And it's kind of a backwards by design process. So by identifying the evidence, then we looked at what are the interactions that a student might have in a test that would then give them the opportunity to provide that evidence. Some of the questions, some of the content is requires students to be able to apply their process skills, and that's challenging for some students if it requires, for instance, typing. And so the alternative is to have students pick stuff out, which tends to be more of a DOK1, a level 1, and identifying but not synthesizing or analyzing. And so trying to figure out how to give students the access to produce an answer rather than identify an answer without overburdening some of the other skills, I think is the challenge there. But if there are an item type that, for instance, some students struggle with more, I'd be interested in knowing more. It sounds like drag and drops particularly, and maybe depending on the circumstances, if the student has access to a mouse or if they're just using a tablet with a pad, their degree of experience, all of that might play into the degree which they can access that. But that's good feedback, and I'll bring that back to my team. Thank you. Other questions at that table? Hey, I might come back to you. What a question from this table?
One I get asked frequently is how much is the performance task weighted?
Yeah.
And I know that sometimes, I think it comes from, like, students will sometimes get that field test PT, and my understanding is that's not weighted at all if they get that. And so they'll see a student that like left it blank but still scored pretty well, and they're like, what happened? Like that sort of thing. So explaining that.
Yeah. There's a couple of things embedded in that. And you're absolutely right. So what we didn't want to do is we didn't want students to have to take 2 performance tasks in a single session, because that would be horrible for them and horrible for educators. And so what we do is we use what we call an augmented CAT. So students who get a performance task, a field test performance task, get a couple of extra computer adaptive questions, which essentially swap out for the measures so that they get the same volume of content with quite a bit less time. The adaptive questions take less time. It's not quite the same level of depth of knowledge though, so but we try and cap the percent of students that take the field test at about 2 to 3%. So at a district level, typically, most students cover the content at the required depth of knowledge. I think the easiest answer is that you can get a good sense of the influence of the performance task by counting up the number of points of the task as compared to the total points for the test. So and for math and ELA it differs, and then within math it differs depending on the number of questions on that performance task. And so if there's 8 points and there's 35 total points, it's about 25% of the test. The real answer, though, is that it also depends on the pattern of student responses and the particular items that a student got. So each scoring is actually unique based on the specific items that a student got and their pattern of responses. Some items are better able to identify the degree to which students have mastered the content versus others are, and it's an odd term, but it's called the discrimination parameter. It's an unfortunate term in large-scale assessment. But an item can, what it means is that students who are high-performing are more frequently get that correct, and students that are low-performing less frequently get that correct. An item with so that discriminates well between students that know the material and don't know the material. There are other items that are kind of mushier. That is that high-performing students tend to might get that wrong more often than right, so around a 50-50 split than as compared to like a 75-25 split. So that item doesn't add a lot more information to the test, but it may be a required element to address the content required by the content standards. And so if we were adapting just purely on measurement, that item that might not be included on the test. But because we have to adapt to the grade level content standards, some mushy items have to be in there. Does that help? Any other questions? I have some more questions, so we'll drill into this a little bit more. And if any other questions pop up, we could talk about it.
I do have one quick question. If that's
Yeah,
okay.
absolutely.
So in terms of the results reporting, why not give results by standard for each teacher?
Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of important elements to that. Probably give me one moment. I'm going to give a coherent answer. So when we think about the cycle of instruction and what is the goal of the assessment? What is the purpose of the assessment? When we're thinking about the end of the year assessment, we're thinking about how did groups of students perform typically, and helping the teacher reflect on the environment that she created for student learning. And that might be the emphasis of instruction, the sequence of instruction, the degree to which groups of students were successful or not successful in demonstrating the content that she was providing, thinking about the curriculum that was used, were those aligned to the content standards. So in that case, it's less about the it's more about the group of content rather than any particular element of content standards, or how groups of students perform. And it's when we're thinking about the interim assessments, we're thinking about drilling more into specific bodies of content. The individual content standards are often interrelated. So, and they're not designed to be addressed in the manner in which teachers teach them. So an example would be when we're thinking about the content standards associated with reading, and we're asking students to comprehend a passage and understand the theme of a passage, or show demonstration of comprehension and identify a theme, we're not necessarily going to address those as different questions on the assessment, because it's likely that the teacher didn't address that as a different element of instruction. She didn't have a unit on comprehension and then a unit on understanding the theme. And so what we tried to do as part of the assessment is we tried to roll those together, those elements of the content standards, in a way that is consistent with how teachers teach it. So as an example, when we created the performance test, we asked faculty at the university, what's the type of skills that, or the type of activities that you give students that are consistent with the ability to understand and analyze evidence from multiple sources and use that evidence as part of an analytical essay. So that's a task that is bundles a lot of different content standards together. If we were to break that out by content standard, there would be a lot of intercorrelation. So it would look like there's a lot of information, but it's actually the same body of information, and it wouldn't necessarily help educators think about their instruction that they delivered and how well students received it. So that's why we give information by target, which is clustered in a manner consistent with how we anticipate teachers will teach it. And we think about the interim assessment as an opportunity to drill into those targets and evaluate their instruction in real time. And then on the summative assessment, we think about groups of students and how they perform on those targets. And we can talk a little bit more about that. Yeah. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks.
Any other questions? So we have two components, the adaptive summative and fixed forms for the interim. The reason why we have fixed forms on the interim is because if you're thinking about a teacher using the data from an assessment and understanding both the questions that was asked and the students' responses to those questions, what would it look like for a teacher if they had a class of 30 and each of those students took 30 different questions? So you have a matrix of 900 student responses. How well would she be able to assimilate that information? Not particularly well. So that was our rationale for keeping the interims as they are. The alternative is thinking about an interim that produces a scale score, which then directs some kind of intervention without potentially understanding the content. Some assessments do that. That's not our theory of action. Our theory of action is that teachers will use the information to change their instructional practice based on an understanding of the individual students' needs and a deep understanding of the content. And so that's how our interims were created. Not sure that this is helpful. Is this what, are you folks interested in more talking about the data? Is this helpful for you to understand some of these larger organizational issues? Are you pretty familiar with this already? Just trying to get a sense from you. Maybe skip forward on this. I'll give you the option, and we'll just move through this quickly and give me some feedback on whether or not this is helpful. So we could talk about some of the accessibility issues and the item types. We've talked a little bit about that. We can talk about the performance tests and how they're allocated, especially in the for ELA, elaboration and evidence and elaboration. Why are they combined? We could talk about some definitions and drill into claim score categories. Why are there only 3 categories identified in the interim, whereas on the summative there are 4 levels of performance? How many of you know the answer to that, or think you know?
I had always thought it was just the number of questions, like not being to differentiate for with a degree of certainty.
Right. You're absolutely right. I think drilling in that a little bit more, when we look at the interim assessments and the claim scores on the summative assessment, we talk about claim score categories rather than achievement levels. And the reason why it's different is that the achievement levels on the summative assessment is basically a lookup table. You can find what the student's score was. You look at the score ranges for each achievement level, the threshold, and you match the two. A student got a 2,000, 2,000 falls in level 2, therefore the achievement level assigned to that test is level 2. With the categories, it's a little bit different. Move around a little bit. The categories are a little bit different. That's a statistical test that compares the student's score with their standard error of measure against the achievement level. So for example, if a student, if the achievement level was 2,000, and a student got a 1,999, and the standard error of measure was 50, that means that if you add 50 to 1,999, that score crosses the achievement level, and so we would say it's not significantly different from the achievement level. That makes sense? The null hypothesis, digging back into your stats days, we're testing the null hypothesis. And so we're not able to assert that it's significantly above or significantly below. It gets a near. Now sometimes states call it at or near. There are very few of the scores that fall in that are actually at the cut score. So if it were at the cut score of 2,000, then it would obviously not be significantly different from the cut score, and the standard error would reach both above and below the cut score in that case. When the report reads that the student is above or below, or significantly above or significantly below, that's 1.5 standard deviations above or below the cut score. So you can be really confident that that score is above or below the cut score. Now, if it's above, chances are really good that the student has demonstrated those skills, unless there's some kind of unapproved resource allocation there that changed the student's score, some cheating going on. Relatively rare and hard to do on the Smart Balance assessment. If the student is significantly below, there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that they just didn't care about the test, right? And so when you're thinking about using those data, you want to think about what are the things we know about that score, and what are the things that we're still uncertain about that score. If the score falls in the at or near, more information is required. You wouldn't want to make a decision. You don't want to ever make a decision based on a single test. You want to collect a lot of information. But there's more uncertainty about what the student does and does not know if they fall into that middle tier, because it's not significantly different. If they're significantly above, probably they've mastered the content, and enrichment might be an option. If they're significantly below, especially if you have additional information about what that student has done in the past around that content, then you can probably allocate some more instructional time or targeted instruction and resource to help the student address that content. Does that make sense? Difference there? And you're absolutely right. The major difference between the summative and claim scores and the IBs is the number of items. So with the overall test, we have about 35 items. Within each claim, there may only be 10 to 15, sometimes 8, depending on the content area. And so there just aren't enough items to make that decision as reliable. That's easy to change, can always add more items, but that makes the test longer. And people don't want to do that usually.
Speaking of that, like, so the ICA is still, to my knowledge, based on the previous blueprints with the longer and then with the adjusted. Has there been talk of revamping the ICA? Or?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the reliability of the adjusted blueprint is pretty close to the reliability of what was the full form because it's adaptive. And so on the full form, there were more questions than needed to actually make the total score reliable. And the reason why there were more questions is because people wanted the claim scores. We had to allocate additional items to each claim score. When we shrunk those and we made the claim scores composite, there were still enough items to make the total score reliable, but there isn't as many items in each claim score, and so we had to combine those. The ICA is a fixed form. And so 40 items on a fixed form, or 45 items on a fixed form, is about the same reliability as 35 items on an adaptive test. And so you're able to save an hour of instruction time, but still have the same degree of reliability in supporting a high quality assessment system. And a fixed form is going to be particularly unreliable for students that are high performing and low performing, which is typically why people are administering the comprehensive assessment, is to identify the students that are mostly at risk. A lot of teachers or educators we hear are administering it to help students become familiar with the assessment, but I think there's that primarily those two dual purposes.
Before you go forward, can I ask to go back a slide actually? Because what I'm hearing from teachers I'm working with around one more, the performance tasks. Can you speak a little bit more to the first bullet, that they're hard to do well? I think that there's an assumption that I'm encountering with teachers that I'm going to prepare my students for the performance tasks with an expectation of what I would expect in a classroom level kind of essay, right? I was wondering if you can share a little bit more about the expectation really of what the performance is on demand, right? Mm-hmm. Because they really are very different, even though I'm seeing a lot of students being prepared for expectations that are much higher because it's more akin to what they're expecting in the classroom instruction with the essay for multiple days and all of that. So if you could speak a little bit more to that first, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think that bullet is ambiguous, and I appreciate the feedback. I think it's hard to do well from a development side. It's hard to do well from instruction and student performance side. So from a development side, each performance task in math costs about $40,000, just to give you a sense of the effort. And the cost is our problem, not your problem. But just to give you a sense of how much effort goes into developing a math performance task, it's both the development itself, but then the accessibility features that are added on that make it a really expensive proposition, which is part of the reasons why we just don't have as many, but also finding educators that have a deep understanding of the content and are able to translate that into tasks that will make sense to students is also, takes a lot of capacity building to find educators that are able to do that. So that's why there's fewer performance tasks generally. For student performance, it's a comprehensive problem. What I hear often is that educators end up focusing on the process or the operations elements of math when they feel that their students are not at grade level and aren't necessarily giving them the opportunity to engage in the higher order thinking of communicating reasoning and problem solving and data analysis, because they're focusing on prerequisite skills as an example. So that when students are encountering these opportunities to demonstrate their higher performing or their higher order thinking, they're not necessarily prepared. So I think there's there's an instructional element and a professional learning element of how do I both bolster and accelerate students' fundamental knowledge while also still offering those opportunities to develop their higher order thinking skills and demonstrate their higher order thinking skills in the classroom. There's often a mismatch between the curricula and the standards, so helping educators and administrators do a match between the content standards that and the expectations of students on the assessment and the degree to which their content, their curricula is addressing that. If they have curricula, so many people don't adopt curricula, they allow their teachers to develop that. That's a key element as well. And then the matching of the students, giving students the opportunity to engage in that practice as part of instruction is really important as well. I don't know, Mary, if that addresses the question mostly, somewhat?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Anything on these key definitions that people have questions about? I think everyone's familiar with how California has adopted the adjusted blueprint, and we talked a little bit about why we now have composite claim scores as compared to the specific claim scores. And so I just wanted to talk about the process that folks might go through to, after you've collected the data, how do you make use of it? And this is somewhat me giving some insights, but also giving you an opportunity to share your practices. So I thought we could talk about 4 different steps, starting with setting the stage, the context for the current year, identifying trends and patterns, identifying then data that differs from expectations, and then the deeper question about why. I did want to note that the National Academy of Education produced a volume called Balanced Assessment Systems, and they're designed to give LEAs and schools a better understanding of what are the conditions that need to be present within a local education agency to utilize a balanced assessment system well. And the process, so Smarter Balance funded this work. Some of the top educational researchers and policymakers contributed this volume. It's extensive, it's 10 chapters, but I think there's some really good insights that you might want to leverage and better understand the system or the possibility there. Why isn't that? Well, I was hoping I could show you the table of contents, but if you just Google National Academy of Education and Balanced Assessment System, you'll be able to find the compendium. And I think it's intended to be written in educator-friendly language, but a toolkit is being developed that will make it a little bit more accessible. It's dense, I will say that. But some examples of the chapters are human learning and development, theoretical perspectives to inform assessment systems, classroom activity systems to support ambitious teaching and assessment literacy and professional learning, district and school practices and assessments to support a learning-centered vision. So really thinking about those elements of infrastructure that you folks are contributing to or responsible for, and how to help develop them so that they help achieve your goals of accelerating student learning. So I find it helpful before I start looking at data and before I start talking about the data, especially with policymakers or board members or administrators that aren't as connected to the data, is trying to do some setting of the stage, some front end work, so it doesn't appear to be a rationalization for what happened. And that's a difficult prospect, but there are things that you know at the beginning of the year that may have consequences for the results at the end of the year, and helping people to remember that when the results come out is a difficult challenge. But it can be helpful in having those conversations about the data and whether or not changes need to be made, or whether or not these data are the result of changes. So one example is identifying any demographic changes that might inform your interpretation of the data. So an example might be that there were an additional or a significant increase in the number of students who have IEPs. We're seeing that in my wife's school district. They had 2 to 3 times the number of students in kindergarten that have IEPs coming into the K-12 system as compared to prior years. And so you can anticipate in 3rd grade, that's going to have some kind of consequence unless that trajectory changes from historical patterns. How many are folks seeing some things like that happening in your earlier grades and anticipating how that will play out?
We've had an interesting situation in our school. This is only our 4th year. So we started with 300 students and we're up to 700.
Oh,
and so
wow.
our data's just been all over because
Yeah.
it's like we get a whole brand new set of scores each year.
Yeah.
So to get that baseline has been tricky.
Are you adding grades, or are you? It's your.
We started TK6, and then just more than doubled in 2.5 or 3.5 years.
Okay. Yeah, that's a challenge.
So looking at data, it's like, okay, but were those our students? We do track students who have been in the district 2 or more years. Parsing
Right.
has actually been really helpful in
Oh,
that
great.
with us, showing us how to track students who have been with us more than a year or more than 2 years.
Yeah, and it's those kind of population analyses, trying to make it comparable, are really helpful. And we know that students that are highly mobile have a different set of performance, and so that becomes a challenge too of having that conversation with administrators so that they understand that this is one way of looking at the data, the cohort-based approach, longitudinal cohort, and it's not the full truth. And that's some of the assessment literacy that could be hard to build. Thank you. Other similar thoughts? So, thank you for sharing a change. Any other changes that folks have experienced or anticipate will possibly will affect how their results look at the end of the year, this year? English language learners, students with disabilities, socioeconomic status, politics, currently, concerns about that your communities have?
From some of the school districts I'm working with, there's a concern of students disappearing. And I think that's something that anyone's working in Central Valley, with particularly the rural schools that have a large migrant student population, that's attached to the agricultural industry. And so knowing that it's a little bit, anticipating the disappearance of data is a little different than, like, say, incoming students or shifting demographics. So I think there's something there to think about how to frame the conversations once the new year data comes in, and how that impacts how we're looking at the students that remain and.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And even the vocabulary
Yeah.
around talking about that, it's a sensitive issue.
Yeah.
And so having some agreement internally about how do we talk about this? recognizing that it's a polarizing element, potentially polarizing element in communities. So honoring and having empathy for the people that that the children are being affected by changes in federal policy, changes in federal approaches, and also recognizing that there's tension in the community around that. In school board meetings, I can imagine that can be very difficult.
Just echoing that, I think we've looked at enrollment in January and just attendance in January, and it's plummeted since, at least in Fresno, from October, November, December,
Yeah.
and then just January is just low.
Yeah.
Still collecting data on obviously what might have caused that, but it's uniform amongst all the regions.
Right. It's not an accident,
No.
right? There's a pattern there, and that's doubly difficult because that has does that have consequences for the funding you receive, or?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
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 That's a year.
Yeah. So maybe I think they said for like every 1%, so like 10 million. Something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's ample reason to believe that teaching matters, and so if students are in classrooms, then they're not learning, and that doesn't mean that teachers aren't doing their job well. And it's pretty easy to to interpret the data as teachers need to do better, and I think that's part of the challenge of addressing low scores and setting the stage to try and mitigate the conclusion that the teachers aren't doing their jobs well. There's this environment that's affecting whether or not students perform well on a test, and it's not just did teachers teach what they were supposed to teach. And so front-ending that conversation and trying to build that assessment literacy before the scores come out, that might take some of the emotion and the reaction out of it. But I think agreeing on the language in advance and setting that up can be helpful.
I think we got tension on both sides. So.
Right.
It's kind of like, so tell me what it is this year that's going to be the reason why scores aren't the way they should be.
I see.
On both sides of that. So
yeah.
So last year was a negotiation year. The year before that, it's something else. The year before that, it is something else. So they want to. I feel that is some of the press and at least Fresno Unified is at least wanting to have some sense of like understanding of what is, I guess, control.
Yeah.
Like operating within the locus of control and trying to figure out, well, can we at least be able to look at apples to apples year over year? And we kind of struggle with some of the external factors playing major roles in what we perceive the data to kind of fluctuate and move, but that's where they're like, okay, well, let's look at something the same way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And so and there's a balance there between trying to seek out positive stories and promoting success and being perceived then as obscuring issues. And so I hear you struggling. I hear the struggle around that. I think the cohort approach is potentially viable there. I think maybe thinking about the schools where leadership has been consistent for a couple of years as well. So not just the students being the same, but maybe same students, same building leadership might help address that. Not necessarily, if the building administrator is the same doesn't mean they're doing better, but at least it's consistent. But I think it sounds like you folks are having those conversations, which is, I think, really positive. So I thought something that is a consequence of NCLB and ESSA is this notion that we have to describe the percent of students that are proficient. And in part, the reason for that is that that's a very clear description of what did or did not happen. The problem is that it's not a very good description of what did and did not happen. So I thought we might take a little bit of time and talk about the differences between percent proficient and the mean scale score. And I don't know if Parsec provides the mean scale score as well. On different reports. Is it available?
There's the mean scale score on the dashboard for state test results. Just distance percentage.
We do have the distance percentage, but I'm not sure about the mean.
Yeah.
I'll double check.
So what do you think is happening if the percent proficient changes, but the mean scale score doesn't? How might you interpret that? So let's say we're talking about third grade math, all students. The percent proficient went up from 46% to 47%, but the mean scale score stayed the same. What might be happening? What are some possible things that may be happening?
The students that didn't meet the standard actually did worse because their scale scores are counteracting the improvements for those that did do better. So overall, more students met standard, but it's becoming kind of a dumbbell distribution.
So there might be more students that are meeting, but those students that didn't meet are actually doing worse, and so you have a divergence, a greater divergence going on. I think that's absolutely possible. And so in that case, do you think you would, if you only looked at percent proficient then, do you think you would come to a different conclusion about what additional information you need or what actions you might take? If in fact you have, another example is the bubble kids. So you have some kids slightly doing better and that pushes them over the threshold, but it's not really a real increase, right? You could have some students that didn't do significantly better as compared to last year, but it was just enough to get over the threshold, and so that's why the mean scale score doesn't change. So I think both of those are possible and important. If the mean changes, but the percentage doesn't, what might that mean? So let's say the mean scale score increased by a full standard deviation, 100 scale score points. But frustratingly, the percent proficient didn't change at all. What might be happening?
The kids are getting better.
What's that?
The kids getting better.
Well, the lower performing kids might have increased a lot. So you may have a very successful intervention going on that's accelerating student learning among the students that you're most worried about, but it doesn't show up in the percent proficient because they're not at level 3 yet. And yet, they're learning a lot and they're doing everything's working exactly the way you intended. So just wanted you to think a little bit more about digging deeper, and if something doesn't look right, we've invested so much. We did this new curriculum. We had tier 2 instruction with intervention, targeted intervention, and percent proficient didn't change. You might not be seeing the whole story. So, wanted to talk a little bit about targets, and how many people, how many of you folks use the target reports or understand them? Okay. So the target reports have two elements to them. One is, did the students as a group do better on a body of content as compared to how they did on the test as a whole? And regardless of how they did on the test as a whole, how well did they do against the performance standard? So the first question asks, you could have a group of students who did really well on data analysis and problem solving, but achieved a level 1 on the overall score. Does that make sense? Because what you're doing is you're looking at, regardless of how well they did overall, what did they do better at or what did they do worse at? So likewise, you could have students that had achieved a level 3 or level 4 on the total score, and they might not have done as well on data analysis and problem solving. So they might have a minus on data analysis and problem solving, and overall, they had a level 4 on the total score. Compared to the performance standard, now you're getting at, regardless of the total score, how well did they do on that target compared to the achievement level. And that's similarly a statistical test, not too dissimilar from the claim score categories. So how might you, or how have you used those target reports? Maybe I can lean on folks that have used them. Do you have an example?
Teachers really like the target reports. And when I talk to teachers about the target reports, I kind of have to, and I hope I'm understanding it correctly, like group the standards underneath for them. So they have like a document that says like, if this is the target, here's all the standards that are underneath so they can kind of figure that out. I've also pulled like the SBAC sample questions. So it's like, here's an example of what this might look like. But teachers love those.
Yeah. Thank you. So a plug suggestion for Parsec is target reports that actually have an opportunity for teachers to see the content standards associated with the targets, so that they can better understand the connection between their instruction and the data that they're seeing. Because you're absolutely right that unfortunately the targets just aren't meaningful directly to teachers. They need to see the cluster of content standards associated with that target. And from a programming standpoint, it should be relatively easy.
Yeah, we don't do anything with the targets yet, so I've been thinking the same thing.
Yeah. What about scope and sequence? When are people talking about the target reports as related to degree of scope, sequence, degree of emphasis? Are you having those conversations with your educators?
Yeah, they'll usually look at like what areas their curriculum focuses on the most, and then kind of compare that to the target and see like, are we performing better on this? And generally it's a yes.
Okay.
If we're emphasizing that.
Yeah, so it starts to make sense to them.
Yeah.
Changing that pattern, that's a little bit more difficult. But at least they're making the connection between what they're doing and what they're seeing. But then going that next step and saying, okay, well now what do we do differently? That's a harder task. Any other stories about targets? One advantage to the target reports on the summative assessment is that you can find direct links to interim assessment blocks. How many folks are using the interim assessment blocks? So that makes sense to both of you. So can you talk about how you're deploying interims in support of specific goals?
So we've kind of waffled the last couple of years post-pandemic, and the performance task had always been kind of a tight, like district-wide, everyone's going to performance task, and we've gone back and forth between, okay, it has to be within this window, or you choose because the content of that performance task might lend itself, especially in math, to a different part of the year. This year, we have said all 3rd through 8th are taking, and we've identified like 2 FIVs or IVs in ELA, 2 in math, and then the performance tasks in both. And which ones were kind of like committees of teachers and looking at the blueprints and major work at grade levels.
Yeah. So you've gone through, if I understand, there was a PLC process where they prioritized their work, and then they chose the IABs that would provide them evidence of progress and change, and then.
Yeah, and district-wide, the TIDE is just, you have to do those.
I
You
see.
can do any that you want,
I see.
but these have to be done, and timing's still left up to the schools and the PLC.
Okay. And is that, was that based on a district prioritization of need, and then, or did it bubble up from PLCs, or
So
how did you arrive at the district?
We've used our diagnostic as iReady, but there was the conversation around that provides my path, and it provides a lot of things, but it doesn't sometimes give us a district-wide lens of, okay, but on just this group of, just this target, or how's what kind of doing. So it was.
So there was
little bit of combination.
yeah, so it sounds like at the district level there was an understanding of, or a goal or an aspiration, maybe in consultation with the board, about an area of improvement, and so you're trying to get a sense of is there progress on that across the district, something like that. Other thoughts about how connecting the interims help? So we have 3 types of connections. We have the relationship between the claim scores and the interims. So the interim blocks dig in a little bit deeper. And then we have connections between the interim blocks and the formative assessment and its practices and instructional resources. That's through the connections playlist. So the goal was to create this comprehensive resource for teachers where they're able to utilize their summative assessment results to understand generally how did students do, get the interim assessments to understand for specific bodies of content, how well are students learning what educators are teaching, and then the formative assessment instructional resources are intended to help teachers elicit that information in a real-time formative assessment process. And so is everyone familiar with the Connections playlist? Sounds like you are. So if you look up Connections playlist, or if you go into Tools for Teachers, you have access for Tools for Teachers. If you look up Connections playlist, they're a powerful resource that can be used independently of the interim assessment. So if you wanted to find out for, let's say, fractions, what are some strategies that teachers might utilize to help students who are not performing or don't seem to be successful in fractions? You can just look directly at the playlist. If you want to then connect that with an interim assessment to help better measure whether or not students seem to master the material, either before or after you use the playlist, that's a possibility as well. So strong recommendation to look at those resources and the associated student activities, because they can really help transform a teacher's interaction with their students. One of the powerful things about those resources is that they include 2 types of strategies. One is formative assessment strategies, where we give an example of, let's say, the fishbowl activity, where students are having a discourse in the middle of the room, and then students on the outside of the room, or the bounds of the room, are evaluating the quality of the discourse, and then the educator is able to evaluate the degree to which students are evaluating the discourse correctly and the quality of discourse that's happening. So that's a formative assessment strategy where in our resources we give an example of that, but if teachers learn that, they can adapt that and use that strategy for other parts of their instruction. The other important element in Tools for Teachers are called accessibility strategies. So what are the practices teachers can use in the classroom to make content accessible for the diversity of students that they serve? And those are also skills that can apply beyond the bounds of the content that the individual resource is addressing. So I think we are over time. Do we have what? 13 more minutes? Okay, thank you. So, you know, after all this is done, we've already talked about after the year's done, you've had your conversations. I think you have a lot of practices in place to make decisions about improvement, working with your educators, your policymakers about what changes are needed, continually monitor progress. You know all that, so you're well skilled in that. I just want to, we don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but just acknowledging that we need to be humble about the assessment system. It is far from perfect. It is, even though we're coming up on our 15th year, it's a complicated process and needs continual improvement. So we have a couple of major initiatives, but it surrounds, I think these three categories describe our emphasis. So we want to elicit information from students about what would make the assessment system work better for them. We want to make changes to the assessment system that makes it more relevant for them. And we want to continue to try and change from a deficit-based approach to an asset-based approach, especially in giving feedback to students and educators. So it's part of our strategic planning process that will culminate in a new strategic plan in June, which then we may have to completely revamp depending on what happens with federal policy. We are holding student focus groups across the nation and asking students what do they want different about tests. And what we've heard generally is they want the tests to be more interesting. They find them boring. And they want more immediate feedback about what they did well and what they didn't do well and what could they change to do better. So those are important calls to action. They're not easy to answer, but just want to acknowledge that we are hearing that and we're working on it. We're also engaging in focus groups about asking students what are the topics that are relevant to them, and we're trying not to put a filter on it, which is it's difficult in this political environment, but asking about their homes, their culture, their religion. We're not asking that specifically. We're giving students opportunities to talk about that, to be clear, because right now the item writers have their own premise about what is important to students and what would engage students in the test. And that's not coming from a student-centered perspective. So we want to think differently about what are the types of reading passages that we include, and can we include a more diverse set of authorship so that we're better able to provide a balanced representation of students' lived experiences in the assessment system rather than a limited or narrow perspective, I guess is probably the best way to describe it. So that work is engaged, and what's really fascinating, what's really important is that students want to talk about this, and we're getting a lot of really good information. We have a grant, Connecticut, we supported Connecticut applying for a grant from the U.S. Department of Education. We don't know what the status of that grant is, consistent with a lot of federal funding freezes. But the purpose of this grant was to try and engage in two aspects. One is eliciting that information from students about what they find interesting, but potentially to use that information to create opportunities for students to choose the topic of the performance test that they might find most interesting. So an example of how that might work is that students would come to the performance task, and rather than jumping right into the task, they might have a brief description of 3 different options, and then they would get to choose one of those 3 options, and then the task would show up. There's a lot of work involved in getting to that point, one of which is finding out what are the topics that students want to engage in. And then the next is, what type of information would we have to give students so that it isn't overwhelming, doesn't take a lot of extra time, and they won't be surprised at what they got based on their choice. So you can imagine students choosing something and saying, well, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, which probably is worse than giving them a randomly assigned topic. That would be frustrating. And so thinking about what would that information look like, and then what is the scaffolding, the accessibility supports that would need to be made available for a variety of students who have a different level of experience and expertise in advocating or selecting content for themselves. We can imagine that for younger students, that's going to be a more difficult process of picking a topic as compared to older students. So what would that look like? What's the role of the educator? And what are some embedded resources that might make that easier? We've revised the mathematics achievement descriptors to make them more asset-based. We're still struggling with the range level achievement descriptors. So the range level achievement descriptors are a description of the progression of knowledge for each target. How many of you have looked at that? It's been a while. Strongly advise you as you're thinking about, when you've identified an area of need, use the range level achievement descriptors as some common language that helps you self-identify, helps your teachers self-identify, well, our students tend to be performing at this level on this target. We want them to be able to do this level of work on this target. And that language for math is really good. It differentiates better the skills for students that are producing evidence at about a 0 at a very low level versus a high level. For ELA, it's not as great. ELA is very difficult to describe progressions in knowledge and skills because it's about their capacity to incrementally engage in more complex texts and give more complex responses. So we're still working on that. But for math, I think we have a really strong description of progression of knowledge. We've evaluated our item writing guidelines. Currently are called fairness and bias and sensitivity guidelines. And so we've been working with a group of folks to help make those more asset-based. An example of a critique is that in our bias and sensitivity guidelines, we describe that pregnancy should be avoided as a concept in an item. And instead, making it more asset-based is describing pregnancy as a natural human event, and that it should be approached through celebration and with positivity rather than as something negative which has consequences for women and perceptions of women. So that's one example. There are numerous other examples. And then I wanted to describe to you, we have revised guidance out there that might be helpful with your conversations with school boards. How many of you have seen the What Does the Scores Mean document? A couple of you have. So what we tried to do is we tried to reinterpret the achievement levels with a grade level context. So right now, there's it's common that the media will report that rather than reporting that 50% of students were proficient on the test, they might report 50% of students can't read or can't read at grade level. And the reality is that proficiency and grade level are different concepts, which you know, but the media doesn't know. So what we tried to do is talk about that when students achieve a level 2, they are actually demonstrating success with some grade level content. Because the only way a student can get a level 2 on their test is to get some grade level content correct. Otherwise, they would be their test would be scored at a level 1. And so it's a tool that helps push back on some of the misinformation, the classification, the weaponization of the summative assessment. So if you Google what do the scores mean, smart and balanced, you'll be able to find that pretty easily. The feedback that we've gotten from advocacy groups, though, which you'll get, is you're obscuring the call to action. And so it turns out that people want the end-of-year student reports to do 2 things. They want the student's performance to be described. They want to know what the student did, but they also want to know what should happen next, what the system will do to support the students. So we're trying to work on how do we make those 2 things clear, that a student can have some success. Level 2 does describe some success, and adults need to accelerate those students' learning. And that's a more nuanced conversation. Celebrating success does not mean ignoring challenges. And doing both are important. In order to maintain the public confidence, to maintain public education, and it's a value for all of us, I'm confident. We have to celebrate the success when we see it. And we need to address challenges. So I hope that document is helpful for you, and we'll try and make it more helpful as we address these concerns from advocacy groups. This is the experts that have been helping us with the item development guidelines as we're thinking about transitioning to a more asset-based, student-centered approach. You may be familiar with some of these folks. They're top of their field, and it's a privilege to work with them. And I think that's everything that I wanted to cover today. So I really appreciate your engagement, your openness to discussion. It was really a pleasure to be able to have a conversation with you. I hope you have a good rest of the year. So thank you.
Thank you.